There are a lot of things from antiquity, early antiquity, that we do not retain. We don't bleed ourselves with leeches anymore. We
Yes.
don't stone to death, depending on where you live, violators of certain crimes and so forth. And there are a lot of religious retentions that have died out. Astrology is a retention that not only has survived, but I'd warrant you couldn't meet anyone in the Western world who doesn't know his or her sun sign and couldn't tell you something about it, and so on and so forth. And the pseudo-rationalists, of course, howl when I talk this way, but not only have they not studied astrology, and I don't expect them to, life is busy, but what they don't realize is that the experts they're counting on, who supposedly have done that studying and come back with the explanation that it's all bullshit and there's no methodological replication, i.e. science, behind this, those experts haven't studied it either. And they're wrong. And they don't know they're wrong because Wikipedia won't tell them that they're wrong. And the fact is, astrology is a remarkable source of insight that is methodologically replicable. And groups of skeptics have done studies and suppressed their own data when it comes up as methodologically replicable.
Is that true?
Yeah, there was a group called PsyCop, which was founded by the ignoble James Randi and some of his pseudo-skeptical followers.
The great Randini.
Yeah. This was in the 1970s, 1980s. They attempted to replicate some studies of astrology that were done by a French astronomer, astrologer named Michel Gagnon. And Michel Gagnon made the case that the planet Mars shows up very commonly and prominently in the lives of championship athletes. So if you're an Olympian or if you're whatever nation you're from, if you're ranked among the champions, Gagnon's research showed that Mars fits very prominently into your chart. So this group of pseudo-skeptics reran his research, and it worked. And they suppressed it, and it split the organization in two. This is just one example of how pseudo-rationalists misunderstand rationalism as outcome versus method. And I work with method. They work with outcome. And so it falls to me, the occult guy, to call them out on their own shortcomings in terms of authentic rationalism, authentic skepticism. Should someone go out and buy a lottery ticket based on their astrological reading? Well, maybe. I'd be very careful. We live under many different laws and forces. I don't believe there's any single super law that governs the individual's life. But is astrology a useful tool? Yeah, I stand by that. Its retention doesn't come from human gullibility. Its retention comes from utility.
Really? And it seems like astrology shows up a lot in history, right? There's so many very famous world leaders, people you'd read about in history books that were also tapped in with having astrologers and getting their signs read and things like that.
Absolutely.
Are there specific examples of famous people historically that are big into astrology?
Well, one of the most famous was Sir Isaac Newton, the father of rationalism, and justly considered the father of rationalism. Isaac Newton actually performed one of the very first English translations of a valuable piece of Hermetic literature, this ancient Greek Egyptian literature called the Emerald Tablet. You can't make this up. His papers, which were just moldering somewhere in a dusty archive, were acquired by the economist John Maynard Keynes just before World War II. And Keynes, in acquiring Newton's private papers, discovered a wild range of alchemical and occult interests. And he said, oh my God, Isaac Newton was not the first of the rationalists. He was the last of the magi. And I would say Isaac Newton was both, and that's his greatness. So you have figures like Newton, without whom we wouldn't have conventional physics. And he nursed a great interest in all of this material. And this was well into what we called the Age of Enlightenment. And again, you'll find figures from deep into the Age of Enlightenment who abided occult practices. In Occult America, I read about Abraham Lincoln holding Civil War era seances in the White House. To Lincoln, I think this was more of a novelty, but to his wife, Mary Todd, it was a deep dedication. And they were so unembarrassed by it that they allowed a reporter from the Boston Telegraph to be present. And it seems strange. Why would you be so disclosing? Why wouldn't you be worried about damage to your reputation? It so happened that during the Civil War, probably some, and I crunch the number as best as I can in Occult America, probably about 10% of Americans participated in spiritualism in the Union and in the Confederacy. And sure enough, the Boston Telegraph report got reprinted in newspapers of the Confederacy. And to some people, it gives pause, and they think, well, maybe this guy's not so bad. I agree with some of this stuff. It was a shrewd political move. I guess all I'm really trying to say is that you've got rationalist figures like Isaac Newton, and then you've got more modern political figures like Ronald and Nancy Reagan, who, in their different ways, doted upon occult ideas.
Yeah, Isaac Newton is such an interesting one because he is touted as, he invents calculus. He's the father of, rationalism and physics. He's a great thinker, which is true.
Yeah.
But also deeply, deeply curious about theological and esoteric themes. I mean, I've heard it said that if you were to interview Isaac Newton and ask him what his job was, he might tell you he's a theologian.
Oh, that's interesting.
He might tell you that he's a spiritualist or an occultist. He might tell you perhaps he's an alchemist, but a physicist would probably not be the first thing, or a mathematician would probably be tertiary in his own personal description.
I think that's a very interesting observation. And his definition of science would probably encompass the extraphysical. He had a lifelong interest in it. I find today that I have an easier time, considerably so, talking to people in the hard sciences and medicine about these subjects than I do people in the social sciences or humanities, or even in cognitive psychology. In cognitive psychology, researchers learn about how we fool ourselves, and that's valid. But it becomes a hammer-nail problem where, because we have myriad ways of fooling ourselves, they see it everywhere, and they suspend observation, they suspend analysis. And the truth is, in the hard sciences, among physicists, chemists, and MDs, they have a realization of how truly bizarre the world gets as you go deeper and deeper. Right. I was just touring the Fermi Lab, a particle accelerator lab in Batavia, Illinois. And I can assure you, we had some far fucking out conversations. And people who run a particle lab are capable, it's theoretical, it's conceptual, but they're capable of talking to you about interdimensionality, about different intersections of time. This lab experiments with a particle called the positron, which is one of the 17 building blocks of matter. The positron has been mathematically demonstrated to move backwards in time. The physicist Richard Feynman won the Nobel Prize in physics for this in 1966.
What?
Yeah. We haven't seen the positron moving backwards in time. That would take a lot of fucking doing to actually... I'm not sure how you would photograph something moving backwards in time, but mathematically, Feynman demonstrated in a 1949 paper that it moves backwards in time. So if one understands that, one can understand that conceptually it's not off the table to have a discussion about time travel. Now, this is at the particle level, but the particle level has implications in our above ground world, which was fashioned and codified by none other than Isaac Newton. So you start to see where idea movements link up. But when they turn into ideologies, and rationalism for a lot of people is an ideology versus a method, it becomes hard to exchange. But when I'm in a room full of physicists, when I'm in a room full of MDs, there might be a few frowns out there, but there is also a really fertile discussion.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the efficacy of astrology, perhaps it has maintained its position within, human behavior for so long because it's effective. And I actually think that like the religious perspective that like my mother would probably say the same thing. She's like, no, it is effective, but you have to be careful with it because of a litany of reasons. But what do you think, if you had to be, the perfect, skeptic, occult scientist person, what would you say is happening that would make astrology potentially an effective, just like an effective sort of heuristic for determining like your life or your future?
Dig. It's a complex question because there's the whole correlation versus causation debate, and that prevails today in the hard sciences, particularly physics. And our ancient ancestors had that same debate over astrology. Does it mirror actions on Earth? Does it cause actions? Is it akin to the planets affecting the flow of the tides, the open and closing of shellfish, a whole myriad range of bodily functions? And even there, one could pose the question, is that causative? Is that correlative? It's an unknown. I speak in general terms of causation. I think there's probably some natural force, and we're comfortable in talking in terms of natural forces of magnetism, gravity, even though in the case of gravity, we don't know fuck all what's going on.
Right.
Mass seems to be attracted to itself. Even in the supposed vacuum of space, mass is attracted to itself. Isaac Newton would have agreed. And the prevalence of unseen forces, including forces that come into play, for example, in clinical lab study of ESP, telepathy, retrocausality, psychokinesis, which have been widely and accurately studied, juried, replicated, published on in mainstream journals. We, as a modern Western society, cannot sustain the crossover of forces from the extra-physical or spiritual world, whatever term one wants to use, into our world.
Mm-hmm.
So one can speak in terms of theology, myth, faith, and so forth. One cannot speak in terms of actual concrete forces entering into our daily above-ground experience like astrology. And yet we have laboratory-based evidence for ESP that we could spend all afternoon discussing. Mm-hmm. It's replicable, it's impeccable, it's bulletproof, it's current. And yet we can't swallow it. We can't swallow it because the ultimate sin of Western society, not so much among the public, but within opinion-making institutions, mainstream journalism, mainstream academia, Wikipedia, the ultimate sin is speaking of extra-physical forces having some actual concrete impact on our world. It doesn't matter how much evidence one amasses. It doesn't matter how elegant a theory one has, and theory is just concept. It can't be considered. And it gets us to the brink of absurdity because these things are as real in terms of evidence as the words I'm speaking, and yet no discussion can be sustained.
Interesting. What would be the most compelling piece of astrological evidence? Like if you were trying to convince a pure skeptic, like the guy that's watching this right now, if you wanted to be like, no, check out this study or check out this person's work, who would you point them to?
Well, I would say probably what we were discussing earlier, the so-called Mars effect that Michel Gagnon studied. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who has an expression, something only has to be a little bit true in order to change everything.